Romans chapter 5. And in Romans 5, Paul is going to speak very directly to this understanding of the human condition. And this explanation Paul's going to give would help us get some handles for why do we do the things we do? Why is it that it seems like sometimes things don't go right for us? Sometimes even when we make adjustments and we think we know the right thing to do, we still don't do it. And so Paul is going to give us these handles for what is this human condition that we find ourselves in. And for this condition, there are three options that have been generally considered as plausible answers for, well, what is an explanation for why, the condition we find ourselves in. So those three typical answers are this. Man is basically good. Secondly, kind of the other end of the spectrum, man is basically bad. Or third, which is kind of in the middle, is that man is born in this kind of neutral place where you're kind of like this blank canvas where you can, through your learning or environment, you can choose good or bad. You kind of start with this, kind of like this blank canvas to be able to consider in your life. So before we see which one of these the Apostle Paul is going to pick, I want to kind of think a little bit about, well, what would you say is the answer? That's rhetorical, so please don't answer out loud. But which would you say seems the most, appropriate in your own, consideration of that kind of question? Austin Ward, writing for the Scientific American, he provides this answer. He says, scientists probe human nature and discover we are all good after all. So this was his conclusion, and he based this on a study that this team of researchers did that monitored instinctual behavior with a reaction to see if those that are part of the study, would they choose selfishness or cooperation. Of course, selfishness being bad and then cooperation being good. And so this was the nature of the study. And what I felt kind of interesting about this is that these two kind of opposite kind of human reactions are the exact thing that you see tested in these reality TV shows like Survivor. So think about Survivor. If you're a fan, I know my wife loves Survivor, so this one's for you, honey. Survivor, that basically what they tell you is, if you're going to win the game, you've got to cooperate. You've got to kind of build this sort of teamwork vibe so everybody includes you and likes you and cooperates with you. But it's all based on winning $1 million or whatever the prize is now. So you've got this selfish, kind of greedy component of beat all the other contestants pitted against let's cooperate, be buddies, and make a good team together. And so the whole TV show is built on the fireworks that take place because these two opposite ends of the spectrum are being pitted against each other. And so this study took those two dynamics, this selfishness and cooperation, and it said, which one would be the instinctual reaction of those that were part of the study. And the findings were the majority of those studied tended towards cooperation, meaning we're all good. So, there you go. According to Adrian Ward, the answer is number one. Man is basically good. French Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if you've heard of this famous philosopher, he answers this question. And he does it by framing it in kind of a rejection of the theology of his day. So he grew up in the 17th century in the midst of the Protestant Reformation. And so his response to this question was to say this: there is no original perversity in the human heart. So what Rousseau is saying is that there is this direct kind of pushback against what the teaching of the Reformation was, which was to say you have this, what the Catholic Church would have said is original sin. or what the Protestant Reformation was teaching around kind of depravity and all of these kinds of things. And so what he pushed back on was to say, there is no perversity in the human heart. That was his position. And here's what Rousseau taught instead. He said, human beings have the ability to change their nature through free will choices instead of being confined to these perverse natural instincts. And so if you think about the Enlightenment as a movement, this makes perfect sense, because if I'm going to become this enlightened, evolved person, which is kind of the vision of the Enlightenment, well, then I need to have the freedom to choose what's better to become all of these good things that are kind of pictured as a part of this movement. So Rousseau would take, if we go back to those three possible answers, Rousseau, his answer would be number 3. Man is born neither good nor bad. You kind of have this open kind of landscape in front of you to decide, what am I going to do with my life? But what God's going to show us in Romans 5, spoiler alert, he's going to pick number 2. Sorry, just kind of go ahead and set the table for you. But he's going to tell us that because of sin, mankind is fallen. And this is going to have an impact on how we engage life. And so I'm going to talk more about the implications of what this means for us, kind of how we understand, sin and its effect on us. But first, I want you to consider what's at stake in having a right understanding about this condition, this human condition that we're starting from. Because here is if you were a note taker, this next point is what I would like for you to kind of have in mind. And it is this. A wrong assessment of the problem leads us to a wrong understanding of the solution. So this is kind of what's at stake by having a wrong view of what is the human condition that I'm starting from. And think of it in the framework of kind of disease. If we wrongly assess the origins of the disease, then we will not understand rightly the source of the cure. We're going to be looking in all the wrong places to find a cure for something because we don't have the right understanding of where it's coming from. And so I'll give you a kind of a simple explanation of kind of the peril of this for us. How this can get us into trouble. A broken arm. So I actually had a broken arm when I was in high school. I suffered this injury. It was very painful, very bad. I was actually in gym class in high school, and I was kind of showing off. I was a basketball player, so I was into hoops. And so I actually kind of ran over to the basketball hoop to jump up and hang on the rim because, I'm a big guy and I love basketball. Well, I get up there, and because I'd kind of had this running start, my legs swung out from under me. And I let go, and my feet are not there, so I catch my fall with my left hand. And I broke my arm right there, both bones. It was nasty. Bad news. I don't advise it. Don't show off in gym class like that because it really hurts. But if you think about this solution to my problem of this broken arm, you could potentially start with a solution that's kind of treating the symptoms. Like, it really hurts, so I'm going to take some pain reliever. I'm going to get some Advil or something. Or maybe I need some really heavy-duty stuff. I'm going to get some morphine or something in my IV. Like, I need some pain reliever because it really hurts. But that, of course, is just going to treat the symptoms. I'm going to wake up the next day and try to use that arm, and I'm going to be, man, that thing still hurts really badly because I haven't gotten to the source of the problem, the root problem, which is that you're going to have to set those bones back together so that it will heal properly. And so that's where, we are in this understanding of, well, what is the true source of my problem? Where is this human condition that I'm starting from that I can understand it so that I can have a right understanding of the solution that I need? So what we're going to see in Romans 5 is a right understanding of the root cause of our condition as well as a solution that truly leads us to life. And so let's begin. Romans chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 12. Sin came into the world through one man, speaking of Adam, and death through sin. And so death spread to all men because all sinned. This is the word of God. So in Romans chapter 5, we're just beginning in verse 12. I do recommend read all of Romans chapter 5 this week to give you a full context. I apologize, I can't read the whole text today because of time, but it is a great analysis by the Apostle Paul of our human condition. And so what he's talking about here is he says, sin came into the world through the one man. So this is speaking of Adam, and you remember the story, Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 3. And what's going on here is Adam and Eve, ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they sinned against God. And in this fall into sin, it's like, Adam and Eve, I'm sorry, you did exactly what God said not to do. I mean, he said, don't touch the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat of the tree, you will surely die. And so like a child that doesn't listen to his parents, they went and did exactly what God said not to do. And so, here they are. They've screwed up. And so there is this judgment of God that's coming. And the judgment that God pronounces over Adam and Eve is exactly what he said would happen, which is that if you eat of the tree, you will surely die. And so with sin came death. And that's what's pictured here in Romans 5 verse 12, is death. Death spread to all men. Now this judgment, I want to notice something about the nature of this death that God's pronouncing over Adam. He says that it is death in two different ways. It is first of all a spiritual death in that the relationship with God was broken. So that was a brokenness that happened, a rupture, an alienation because of the fall of Adam into sin. But then secondly, it is a physical death. Adam and Eve would physically die. Their bodies would return to the earth, and this was something that was not supposed to ever happen. They were supposed to live in the presence of God forever, and because of sin, physical death entered the world for Adam and Eve, and they would both physically die, just as God said. But bad news, it gets worse. As if it could get any worse, it gets worse. So look at this. Sin came into the world through one man, and so death spread to all men. Notice this. All men, they received from Adam this same sentence of death from even though they didn't have this same position as Adam and Eve in the garden, in this situation, nonetheless, we all had this sentence of death, spiritual death, physical death, that Adam and Eve got. It's as if Adam tied a rope around his waist, jumped into the pit, and dragged the whole human race with them. And Paul gives this devastating proof. This is so spot on, and I don't think I have this verse, but in your Bibles, if you want to go back and look, Romans chapter 5, verse 14 says this: death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam. You follow what Paul's saying there? So, he says that even though the children of Adam and Eve, Cain, Abel, Seth, if you read through Genesis account, you see all these children of Adam and Eve. And what he says is, they all died. And so think about this. They didn't get the royal treatment like Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve were told directly by God, here's a tree, don't eat from this tree, or you will die. So God doesn't show up to Cain and Abel and say, hey, you know what? I wouldn't do like your parents did and eat from this tree. It's going to be bad news. They did not get any such explicit instruction. That's why it says, sorry, I don't have the verse up there. That's why it says that their sinning was not like the transgression of Adam. But nonetheless, they all died. They all suffered the same judgment of God that Adam and Eve did. So it's this proof of that judgment continues. Even though they didn't have the same transgression that Adam and Eve did, they died. They suffered the spiritual and physical death that Adam and Eve did. It is, to this day, the same as it was for them. It's the ultimate statistic. 1 and 1 die. It's foolproof. Statistically speaking, you've got a great shot. If you're going to pronounce somebody, one day you're going to die, because that's the way it is even for us, just like it was for them. And so, if we go back to our 3 answers of the human condition that we kind of started with, the answer that Paul is giving in Romans 5 is not that we're basically good, like the scientific study was trying to say. It's not that we are born in some kind of neutral state of those that grow and learn and try to decide which direction do we want to go. We are, because we are in Adam, we are born sinful, corrupt, spiritually dead before God. But I want to be a little bit more specific about this, because this is a little generic to just say man is basically bad. I want to get a little bit more specific about the condition we find ourselves in. Because in a broad way, if I simply say we, like Adam, are sinners, well, no duh. I mean, everybody in this room knows we've done things that are wrong. That's not a news flash. It's obvious to us that we all have these sinful things in our lives. But it's also true on the other end of the spectrum that we don't do the most evil possible thing we could do all the time, right? We're not like evil to the core where we just always do bad things. It's kind of like in that scientific study. There was some cooperation going on, and we know that in our life. Sometimes we will help people. We'll cooperate, and that happens. So it's not as if we are always prone to do the exact worst possible thing we could ever do. We also have experienced this as well. But what I want you to see in this Romans chapter 5 understanding of the nature of our sin is that it has corrupted us in the most damaging way that it possibly could. Is that we are spiritually dead before God. So just to kind of give you a word picture, Romans 5 verse 16, if you read verse 16, it says, the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation. So this is the Romans 5 language for there was this judgment of God against sin of Adam, and it brought condemnation. It brought to Adam this alienation from God. It brought the separation relationally from God, so that now he has this distance from God that can't be healed. It's broken. And that's why Adam and Eve, if you read the account in Genesis 3, they hid from God in the garden because that relationship had been broken. It's why ultimately they're going to get kicked out of the garden and no longer able to walk with God in the cool of the day, because they have relationally had this breakdown with God. And so the sin that Adam and Eve had, ultimately all of mankind now have this spiritual death in our relationship with God. And that means there exists in our nature no longer the desire to seek God or love God or please God or worship God. All of those instincts relationally towards God have been broken. They are no longer in our nature, and that's the fallen, that's the predicament of the fallen nature that we have inherited from Adam. And, that helps explain why, well, it's not as if I have to do the most evil possible thing every time I interact with another person. But what it has left us is we are completely unable to do anything spiritually good. Anything that would, in fact, bring glory to God. Anything that would show that love and worship and honor for God. We have lost the ability, the capacity to do this. The great American theologian Jonathan Edwards describes this condition. James Montgomery Boyce, in his book, The Doctrines of Grace, kind of paraphrases this statement from Edwards to describe our situation. He says, here we get to the heart of the problem as it involves seeking or choosing God. When confronted with God, the mind of a sinner never thinks that God's way is good, that the will is free to choose God, nothing is stopping it, but the mind does not regard submission to God and service to God as desirable. Rather, it turns from God, even when the gospel is presented most winsomely. Therefore, unless God changes the way we think, which he does through the miracle of the new birth, we're going to talk about that in a moment, our minds will always tell us to turn from God. So, this is the predicament that we're in. And Edwards provides this very compelling example from the natural world of carnivores and herbivores. So, any of the Jurassic Park fans, you know the dinosaurs, you probably very quickly identify how all this works, right, with the carnivores and the herbivores. So, a herbivore is an animal that eats plants. And a carnivore is an animal that eats meat. So if a carnivore, like a lion, let's say the lion is a carnivore, and if you presented a lion with oats or hay, like a herbivore would eat, and you said, here you go, here's some food, you can have this, then he would say, I can't eat this food because I hate it. I only eat meat. This is the food that the nature is to eat this other kind of food, not to eat these oats and this hay and these things that you have presented. So compare this to Psalm 34:8, which says, taste and see that the Lord is good. So why wouldn't we who are in Adam, in this corrupt, sinful place, why is it that we will not taste and see that the Lord is good? Because, just like the lion's words, it's because we hate that kind of food. This is not in our nature, in this spiritually dead place. We have no appetite for this food, for love, worship, and glorifying God. And so this is the true root cause of this human condition, of this problem that we find ourselves in. So if you put up that phrase that we kind of started with today, a wrong assessment of the problem leads us to a wrong understanding of the solution. So I want you to think about this. If we have this, wrong diagnosis of the problem, if that's where we are, what we're going to be left with is we're thinking, well, how can I, in my own strength, try harder, do better? In some, we think about in our own lives kind of experientially. There's ways that we might incrementally grow. Maybe we learn from some of the mistakes of our youth and we try to get better and better. But this is the equivalent of treating the symptoms without getting to that root cause. It is the equivalent of taking Advil when your arm is still broken. That's the position that we found ourselves, because I've still not gotten to the root problem, which is this sin and spiritual death before God that Romans 5 is describing. So, having this right understanding of the nature of our problem, of where we are, what is the solution? Well, of course, Romans 5 is going to give to us what that answer is. So let's look, Romans chapter 5, verse 18. Therefore, as one trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one act of righteousness leads to justification in life for all men. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience many will be made righteous. So this is the healing work. This is the work of God to heal that root cause, that root problem that we suffer from in our human condition. That we would see our broken lives and our sinful hearts and our alienation from God, that that would be healed. Two words I want to highlight from this. The first is justification. So God sent his Son that we would be justified. And that is that this judgment from God against Adam for his sin that led to condemnation, that brought the relational separation that we're talking about, this alienation from God that we suffer from in our fallen condition, by the one man's obedience, this one act of righteousness at the cross, he has justified. He has taken that just anger of God, the wrath of God against that sinful place, against the enmity that existed in that relationship. He took it at the cross so that we could have that relationship restored. And we were made righteous. So we receive from Christ the very good life, the perfect life that he lived in, his righteousness before God. And it is given to us, which means all of those broken evidences that we see in our lives, he is healing that through Christ. He is doing this work to make us righteous in our lives. And so, when we find ourselves with this wrong assessment of the problem that we've kind of been talking about today, where we think wrongly about the human condition. We think wrongly about the real source of our problem. When we get there, what we end up thinking is that we have a performance problem. If I could summarize kind of that example we've been talking about, it's like I've got to perform better. I'll try harder next time. I'm going to do the right thing next time. But what Romans 5 is saying is that, in fact, your problem is not a performance problem. It's a spiritual problem. It is that you are spiritually dead, and there is no performance that you can come up with that is going to fix this problem. The nature of this problem is not that. It is a spiritual problem. And so the solution to our spiritual death is a supernatural work that only God can do. And that's what he has done. This newness of life, this new birth, that spiritually blind eyes would be opened. This is what God has done in Christ to justify and make righteous us by his work on our behalf. Ephesians 2 speaks to this supernatural work this way. Ephesians 2 verse 5. But God, being rich in mercy, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. So I want you to notice, he says, when we were dead in our trespasses, so we were, as Romans 5 has said, we were spiritually dead before God. This is where we find ourselves. We are not the drowning man in the sea who's trying to stay alive and reaching out for that life preserver that got thrown out to us. We are dead on the bottom of the ocean floor with no hope apart from God. But God made us alive. He brought resurrection life to these spiritually dead bodies. He brought life. This is what God has done. And this is the incredible grace that God has given to you, that he is speaking to you to awaken this dead heart to new life. So for us today, as we see this, now we have that right answer, this right solution to the true source, the root cause of our problem that we want to have in our lives. The encouragement that I want to give to you, the charge that I would have for you is this, and it's straight from Hebrews 3, chapter 3, verse 15. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. So think about this. We don't understand how dire the situation that we find ourselves in. We treat lightly the fact that we are spiritually dead before God. And that the only way for us to have that redeeming work is that God, by his grace, extend this to us through Christ. And so we kind of get stuck in that wrong diagnosis of our human condition, thinking, I didn't do so well last time. I'm going to do better next time. I'm going to fix all those bad things I've been doing. I'm going to make the problem better. And that's where we end up going and how we think we can fix the problem. And so we treat lightly the dire situation that we're in, that we can't fix it. There's no performance you can come up with next time around that's going to address this root problem. And so you think about this and you say, if today you hear his voice, meaning if God is speaking this powerful, redemptive, life-giving word to you, then really that is my prayer today. As we are here gathered, hearing the word of God and seeking his face as his people, that is my prayer for every one of us, is that he would speak this powerful word of his grace into our lives. And so if he speaks that word, do not harden your heart. Because it is our hope. He is our salvation. His grace is the solution to our problem. He is at work. If you receive that word, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Receive his grace. And I want you to notice something incredible about this. If you think about this grace from God that we're talking about, the fact that it must be in our spiritually dead condition, that this voice that's speaking to us, this resurrection life that's coming, it has to be from God. So if you have had in your heart this instinct to turn to God, this repentant heart, this desire to love God, that did not come from you. There's not a bone in your body that exists that will turn to God. In Adam, we are spiritually dead. And so if you look into your life and you say, this is the instinct I have, this is God. Don't let your mind play tricks on you and say, oh, I don't know, I think I had a bad pizza last night that, I'm just not sure I'm thinking straight. If he has done this work to speak to you, to turn your heart, that is the life-giving grace of God doing its work in your heart, that you would know him. That you would hear his voice and turn to him and receive this resurrection life that he is offering to you. So I'll close with just a quote from strange source, actor Jim Carrey. So Jim Carrey, famous actor, he was in movies like Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, Dumb and Dumber, both of which movies I have seen, true. But the movie probably our family has watched the most has been The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, which, very funny. But Carrey, reflecting on his own life, says this: I think everyone should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so that they can see it's not the answer. So here's Jim Carrey, rich, famous, successful guy, and we're back here. If Jim Carrey's over here, we're way back here. We don't have all the stuff, all the popularity, all the accomplishments like Jim Carrey. And so we think, oh man, if I got the stuff like Jim Carrey has, if I was successful, then I would solve the problem. I would have cracked the code on my broken life and all of the problems that I face. That's that wrong diagnosis of the problem that we keep thinking is going to fix the issue. And here is Jim Carrey, who has arrived at that destination, and he's saying that's not the solution. But we won't accept that. We're going to keep working until we get there, and then we'll find out all along it wasn't the solution. Because we've been so taught that that's the way, that's how you fix the problem. The right understanding of the problem is that it's not a performance problem. It's not fix it all, do it again, get it right. It is a spiritual problem. God is speaking today. The cure for the disease. Newness of life, spiritual life. So hear this word that he's spoken to you. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Let's pray.